Now, we are here today with Allison Glenn, Senior Curator and Director of Public Art at the Contemporary Arts Museum, Houston. And she will discuss her curatorial work on the celebrated show Promise, Witness, Remembrance, a 2021 exhibit at the Speed Museum in Louisville, Kentucky. Glenn has over a decade of experience in the curatorial field. She was the curatorial associate for Prospect 4 New Orleans International Art Triennial, and more recently was the associate curator of contemporary art at Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art, where she shaped how outdoor sculpture activated their 120-acre campus. We are so glad to have her here today, and Allison, you can take it away.
Thank you so much. Quickly, before I jump into the presentation, I just want to thank Jack LaHave, Eddie Long, and the Parge team for inviting me to speak. And thank you to the staff of the Florence Griswold Museum for hosting this event. So in my work at Crystal Bridges, which was concurrent but also predated my time at the Speed Art Museum, I think that's a really great place for us to start, especially knowing that Parge is very invested in conversations around public art. One of the big questions for me, or the questions for me that loom large, are, do artists have a social responsibility? And if so, what are the aesthetics of a socially engaged practice? How are artists working within, along, and outside of institutional boundaries? And what is at stake? And I chose to start with this image of a work by Odile Donald Odita. It's called Negative Space. I commissioned this in 2018. It was one of my first public projects at Crystal Bridges. And it was about midsummer. It was when we were hearing about families being detained at the southern border to the United States, families who were perhaps illegally crossing the border from Mexico into the United States. And the conversation around the detainment of families, the separation of families, was so, it was a very challenging conversation, very challenging understanding for many people in the world and many artists to reckon with. And so when I asked Odile, who I'd worked with previously at Prospect, to consider what a new site-specific sculpture in our 120-acre forest would look like, he decided to look to the past and think about the future simultaneously. And that's where we get all of the parts of this work. So Negative Space consists of 13 4x5-foot flags on 20-foot flagpoles. And as you see here in the image, the flagpoles are oriented at a 45-degree angle so that the flags themselves hang over the walkway. And in that sense, in order to traverse the forest and see it in its entirety, one must move their body under these flags to move through it. For Odile, the movement of one's body under the flags implicates everybody. 13 is a number that's used to point to the original 13 colonies. And you see that the colors of the American flag, so red, white, and blue, were interspersed by their complementary colors of green, orange, and black. The intention here by the artist was to use color theory as a way to articulate that difference enhances. And he did that by taking the complementary colors for each color in the American flag and abstracting them into this stripe pattern. So once again, underscoring the idea that difference in fact enhances. And I think that's a really great place to start this conversation and a larger dialogue around the importance of artists who are working within, along, and outside of institutional boundaries, specifically as it relates to this exhibition that I had the privilege to work on at the Speed Art Museum.
As a city struggling to respond, to grieve, to react, to move forward, following the killing of Breonna Taylor, other deaths that followed, a year of protests, an enormous spike in gun violence across the city and the country. This exhibit from the beginning has represented our attempt, like what would it look like for a museum to try to serve a city going through what Louisville's been going through, to try to serve our country at a time of need.
When you walk into the museum, into the galleries, on your sightline, you see the portrait of Breonna Taylor painted by Amy Sherald. It's the only thing you see. If you've come to the museum to just see that painting, you know exactly where to find it. If you want to engage with the exhibition as a concept, you can also do that. So the intention with this placement was to make the portrait accessible, to make people feel comfortable, to know where they were intending to go, to also understand the importance of this exhibition in relationship to the story of Breonna Taylor. The title Promise, Witness, Remembrance was developed from a conversation I had with Tamika Palmer when I asked her what this exhibition could do for her and represent for her daughter's legacy. It was also important to understand that this exhibition was meant to connect the local to the national. So when I first started on this journey, I knew where the painting was going to end up. I knew that it was going to be co-acquired by the Smithsonian and by the Speed Museum. And so I looked pointedly to how I could start that conversation between the local and national throughout the exhibition, thinking about promise, you know, so the sections, the artworks, artists.
Oh, say, can you see by freedom's clear light?
The first section is promise, which is the promise of a nation and the symbols that the promise is meant to afford its citizens. Key things like national anthems, flags, voting rights, and the military that uphold them are what artists and artworks in this section look at. Paint Willis Thomas has the two works, the flags that are flanking the doors, and each star represents a person killed by gun violence in the United States in the year that they represent.
Your liberty's dying.
The next section, Witness, thinks not only about the curatorial framework, but also about visitors to the museum. I anticipate many will be first-time visitors. So this portion of the exhibition really unpacks what artists do. Artists help us understand the contemporary moment. And in this section, I've paired historical works with more contemporary ones to tell a larger story about witnessing and sometimes protesting. The muffled drums, it's one of the first protests or marches for Black lives in the United States. And it was organized by the NAACP. And then the protest photographs of Louisville, focusing on historic, contemporary, you know, timely but enduring. Remembrance is a section that looks at artworks that have been created to honor those lost to gun violence and or police brutality and their legacies. The exhibition was developed in conversation with many key constituents. I initially developed a national panel of advisors to guide the conversation from the onset. These people come from very different walks of life. They've all experienced gun violence and or police brutality, either in their families or communities, or stand in solidarity. I spent a lot of time listening to the Louisville Steering Committee and also the team at the Speed Museum. And from these conversations, alongside listening to Tamika Palmer, is how the curatorial framework developed.
I'm hoping that this type of work, this type of co-creation, where we've worked with community has had a voice, not just a superficial voice, but a really in-depth autonomy as of the outcome that happens. I'm hoping that that becomes a new model, that institutions learn from us, that this can happen. You can work with community and make programming and exhibitions together.
So at the Speed, our mission is to invite everyone to celebrate art forever. So consistent with that, and also because of the nature of this exhibit, everything about it is free. Admission, parking, we want this to be extremely accessible for a lot of reasons. One, no one should be making money off of this experience, and we aren't. But even more so, we want everyone to come through this exhibit together.
Every visitor is going to be different. I'm going to have a different experience because I'm a Black woman. I'm at the heart of things that are happening here. So I experience it as first person. But if you have not been at the heart of what is happening here, taking that in and really understanding someone else's truth, right? Through their voice, through their eyes is important, but also really reflecting on your place in that, right? Have you been supportive of this movement? Has it been a little intimidating or frightening at some points? And really examining kind of how we can move forward together.
Really key questions at the onset were key questions that we were all asking. The project team that reached out to me had already done some incredible groundwork. They had already identified funding and were working and had the permission of Breonna Taylor's mother, Tamika Palmer, to pursue some sort of activation around the portrait. They also knew that the portrait was going to be co-acquired by the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture and the Speed Art Museum. And so when they reached out to me and invited me to think about how to either interpret the painting or activate the painting, there were some, I had an ambition that was larger than I think they initially anticipated, but it was so well received and I felt very supported by the entire museum, the director, board, that I was really able to move forward in a way that benefited everyone involved. Some of the big questions for me from the onset was, how does curatorial work address a site of trauma? Who are the key players here? And what is the project's focus and goal? And how can we keep this in focus? And so to realize that some of the work was being done and had already been done, in particular, the community engagement, there is a brilliant person working at the Speed Art Museum named Toya Northington, and she's their community engagement strategist. Toya convened 3 different committees that were meant to represent Louisville publics, right, plural, communities, plural, people who were invested in this conversation, who were going to give really important feedback to me and help guide the thesis. In addition to that, I built my own panel. Part of the reason was that I wanted to show the solidarity that I had for the Louisville community by assembling a group of national advisors, people who had perhaps a similar purview from a different place, for many reasons, but one of them, because this topic was so important, because we were responding to the killing of Breonna Taylor so quickly, because it was such a sensitive conversation. I wanted to have a cabinet of advisors who knew me and who I could trust. And so my first phone call after I accepted the project and after I spoke with Amy Sherald about it was to Theaster Gates. I had the privilege of working with Theaster a couple times after graduate school. And what was most important about his mentorship on the panel was that he had successfully worked with the Tamir Rice Foundation to recite the gazebo where Tamir Rice was killed by the police. He recited it outside of Stony Island Arts Bank. And before he even placed it publicly, he had it on view, disassembled in Stony Island Arts Bank for at least a year, so that the communities could have conversations around it, so that people could feel comfortable with what he was doing. After speaking with Theaster and Amy, it just kept building very quickly. I asked Hank Willis Thomas to be a part of the panel. Hank has made his life's work focused on social justice and art as activism. Hank's story is also personal. He lost his cousin Sangha to gun violence 21 years ago, and his work from that point forward really turned towards issues of art and activism, specifically as they relate to gun violence. Mecca Brooks, who works as senior strategist in his studio, was also a keen collaborator. Lakeisha Leek, who is a friend, and I met her while working for Theaster Gates. Lakeisha works for the MacArthur Foundation in Chicago, and she is also Trayvon Martin's cousin. And we were working together for Theaster when Trayvon was killed and worked together on programming to address it. John Cesare Goff came on board. John is a filmmaker, and his mentor was, one of his mentors was Reverend Clementa Pinckney, who was one of the 9 people killed by the white supremacist at the Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina in 2015. So I knew John also, just like Theaster and Hank and Amy, had addressed difficult and traumatic subject matter in his work. He had made work about his community, and he also had the ability to give feedback. I invited 2 additional people. Raymond Green he lives in Northwest Arkansas, and he is one of the cousins of Alton Sterling. So not someone in the art world, but someone who could give keen feedback about a similarly high-profile police brutality incident, and perhaps speak from the perspective of another family. And then the final person I asked to join was Dr. Allison K. Young. I met Allison while I lived in New Orleans, and I find her to be a brilliant thinker. She has a real sensitivity and empathetic nature. She also is a professor at LSU, so really thinking about how to engage with multiple communities, including college students. And she looks at art of the global South. And then finally, after thinking about all of the stakeholders and trying to understand where and how, as a curator, I could prioritize conversations to communicate an idea around how to contextualize the portrait, I reached out to Tamika Palmer, who is Breonna Taylor's mother. And I came into this conversation with her initially with support from the Speed Museum, and continued the conversation because we built such a great rapport. Everyone had so many ideas on what this could do, what this moment would be. And I knew that I needed to get clear from Tamika Palmer about what it meant to her and her daughter's legacy. And she was able to share some really kind of key points that have been guideposts for me. She said, "This exhibition will continue to do what Bree has always done for us, and that is to continue to bring people together. Only this time people are wanting to learn her story and to continue to stand for her and even celebrate some and how she changed the world." And for Tamika, there were 3 points that I translated into promise, witness, remembrance. The mark that she left upon all of us, the struggles we went and are continuing to go through to get justice for her, and the laws and policies that were changed because of the injustice that she experienced. So I began to have ambition for an exhibition and understood very clearly that the site of the Speed Art Museum and the galleries that we were able to choose, either the contemporary galleries or the older original building, would have as much impact as the artworks that were chosen to contextualize the portrait. When we were able to land on the galleries that the exhibition is installed within, there was this other kind of gesture of communication. When I was developing my thesis, I pinged back and forth to the National Panel for Feedback and Guidance, and then the Louisville Steering Committee, back to the National Panel, back to the committee, and on, and of course also interfaced with Tamika Palmer. What I heard in a lot of the conversations from local residents was that they didn't see images of themselves reflected in the museum, and specifically before the contemporary wing was built. And the galleries that held the exhibition were typically the place where the Dutch and Flemish collection would be held. Collecting institutions leave things on view for a long period of time. It's part of the mission of a collection is to give it light. So deinstalling those galleries had never been done before in its entirety, and it also acted as a decolonizing of that space. In the first gallery, I really wanted to look at and set the stage around rights and the legal issues and liberty, this idea of liberty and public and community. And so I thought that working with artists to think about symbolic representations of our nation and its promise, such as national anthems, voting rights, and constitutions, would be a great way to set the stage. So in the first gallery, contemporary artists explored the shared beliefs and values of the United States through the symbols that uphold them: the Star-Spangled Banner, presidential elections, the preamble to the Constitution, and the military. These 4 works asked us to consider the symbols of the United States and how they have changed and shifted over time, provoking questions such as, what does the promise of the United States mean to its citizens? For whom were these rights afforded? And how do we ensure that these rights are protected in the future? This is an installation view of the first gallery. And I'm taken back to the question that Stephen Riley, who's the former executive director of the Speed Art Museum, he posed a question at the beginning of the film, what would it look like? And so for me, as I was framing my panel and framing ideas, I thought who better to consult on what it would look like than artists. So of course, Hank Willis Thomas, who's a part of the national panel, also contributed works to the exhibition. He created 2 new textiles from his Falling Stars series, and these flags are part of an ongoing annual series that he first began in 2016. So here, Thomas has appropriated the iconography of the American flag, but instead of representing states, Thomas's stars represent each person murdered by gun violence in the United States in the year the flag was created. These textile flags memorialize the thousands of people lost in 2019 and 2020, which includes not only Breonna Taylor, but also 3 others who were lost to gun violence who are around and a part of the story of Breonna Taylor, which includes the protest movement. And that is Travis Najdi, David McAtee, and Tyler Girth. So not only does it memorialize, but for Thomas, these pay homage to the countless loved ones who carry perpetual grief and trauma as unacknowledged victims of gun violence in America. This is an installation view of his work from 2018 called 14,719, which was installed at Crystal Bridges during his mid-career survey that I had the opportunity to organize as part of the touring venue from the original Portland Art Museum exhibition. This is another installation view from that exhibition. This particular work looked at those in the community impacted by gun violence. And the portraits represent his cousin Songa's family and friends. The blank spaces in between represent those who the artist perhaps doesn't know, those who are impacted that are perhaps too challenging to count. In the second gallery, I really wanted to drive home what artists do. I knew that there'd be so many first-time visitors to the museum, and I wanted to kind of pull back the curtain, so to speak, around what contemporary art is and what it's doing. So artists help us understand the contemporary moment. They're often responding to the politics, fears, fashion, and cultural trends of the time they are living in. During the time of organizing this exhibition, it was December 2020 is when I began. The exhibition opened early April 2021. During that time, we received a vaccine for the coronavirus, but at the time of developing this, we did not have that. So it was an unprecedented and remains an unprecedented and historic moment. In the midst of a global pandemic, incidents of police brutality and gun violence against Black and Brown communities continued to take place with almost no recourse. Sadly, that hasn't changed. But in Louisville, in particular, Breonna Taylor's family still has not gotten the justice they seek. In these galleries, I included an intergenerational grouping of artists who have made work that bears witness to the historical events they have lived through. From Louisville native Sam Gilliam, pushing against the boundaries of painting, to Alicia Wormsley's Afrofuturist Manifesto for Black Lives, and from Terry Adkins' monumental sculpture to visual documentation of recent protests created by Louisville-based photographers. This combination of artists' responses to expectations, ideas, and fears are both current and enduring. This is one of the installation views of the second gallery. And as you can see, what remains on your sightline is the portrait of Breonna Taylor. It was very important to me and to the national panel, we went back and forth in a couple different placement ideas, landed on this one, because it would guide people through the exhibition space. The 22-foot ceilings, terrazzo marble floors, and marble arched doorways and marble columns around the doorways had this effect of framing the portrait. So when you were standing at the entrance, that's all you would see. And it really not only articulated where people wanted to go, but carved out a very clear pathway. Another way that the Community Engagement Committee was really able to support the curatorial work was through photography. So because it was such a unique moment in time where people were not traveling, we were not meeting together in closed door spaces, we were not gathering together, it was very difficult for me to do studio visits with local artists, but I knew and had heard and was trying to respond to the fact that the Louisville committee really wanted me to include local artists. And so I asked them, well, what about the protests? What about photographs from the protests? Could you please put together a collective list of artists that you think I should look at and include their contact information if you have it, but definitely website links, and I'll do my research virtually. And they sent me such a long list, which was amazing. And from that list, I chose 5 photographers. And I chose the 5 photographers for various reasons. This is an image by photographer John P. Cherry, who is not only an incredible community activist and leader, but also was really an ally and friend to me during this process and made sure that I understood the ins and outs of a community that I was not from and had spent very minimal time with. So this is an image he took of Travis Najdi. Travis, as I mentioned before, was shot and killed in an unrelated incident to the protests, but Travis had found his voice in the protest movement, and he was a young man who had been previously incarcerated for, not very serious crimes, so kind of in and out, and found his voice and his calling in activism, and really was a leader of the protest movements in Louisville. And he was shot and killed either right after leaving a protest or right before arriving to one. And so I really wanted to memorialize him in the galleries and a portrait of him in the galleries in a way because this is the story of Breonna Taylor. Another photographer is Xavier Burrell, and I love Xavier's story because he was an amateur photographer. He, I believe, was a Marine, so he service to the country, and he went down to the protests and started documenting them daily. And that's really where his eye developed. So self-taught photographer, captured some of the most important moments during the protests. And this was right after Dan Cameron announced the verdict that there would be no, the police officers would not be charged for the murder of Breonna Taylor. So of course, the streets erupted, and although I was really uninterested in showing images of trauma in the exhibition, I also felt that it was very important to not edit the archive. And this was a moment, and this photograph speaks volumes. There is one man in the center of at least 15 police officers, all staring right at him, some of them attacking him. And it just speaks to an imbalance here. This is another image by Eric Branch, and I chose this image because it includes not only Breonna Taylor's mother, but also her sister. It includes Travis Najdi, many of the leaders from Until Freedom, who were also very instrumental in giving feedback on the community committees. So I wanted to have an opportunity to depict the community in the galleries. Another artist that was on the national panel that I mentioned was really one of the first phone calls is Theaster Gates. And Theaster showed a work that was so indicative of his practice of kind of appropriation, and it's reconfiguring ideas, this questioning, almost slight trickster, but not really, but raising and heightening our awareness of current things. So this particular work is called All's My Life I Has to Fight, and the title of the work was appropriated from, or maybe more commonly known as the title of a Kendrick Lamar video that I'm going to show a snippet of in a moment. And the Kendrick Lamar song title was obviously appropriated by Alice Walker's The Color Purple. That was a 1982 film that starred Oprah Winfrey. So in this work, a bronze sculpture of Madonna and Child are surrounded by a fence enclosure. When you walked around the artwork, it was really interesting that although it was quite heavy materials, the sculpture seemed to levitate. And it really, for me, raised questions of if the cage was intended to protect or restrict. Both Lamar's lyrics and Sophia, who was Oprah Winfrey's character in The Color Purple, who defied and fought back against diversity, both the usage of Lamar's lyrics and Sophia's defiance are a protest, rejection, and reminder that, despite all odds, one can overcome. Its usage by Gates points to the strength and perseverance of Black women. And I have a very short snippet of that film to show.
Lost my life, I had to fight.
So Theaster Gates, much like Hank Willis Thomas, has really spent his career thinking about communities and working in public space, often using the physicality of abandoned homes as a medium. So his practice creates sculptural and experiential works of art that are both responsive to and reflexive of the sites where they exist. So in this sense, his work is a conceptualization, the conceptualization of his work is in direct response to the site in which it is situated. These projects are a combination of socially engaged practice, pedagogy, relational aesthetics, architecture, and design. Fusing aesthetics and theory with practical solutions to everyday living and/or places to congregate, this type of urban renewal oftentimes happens outside of institutions. And locating his work outside of the gallery, although in dialogue with it, at times offers the opportunity to frame the practice outside of the prescription of the white cube. Another artist that was included posthumously in the witness section is Terry Adkins. Terry Adkins' work, as you see here, is the stack of 8 drums. And it's originally produced with 11 drums. This sculpture is sometimes displayed with 8, as you see here. For Adkins, affinity towards the symmetry and repetition of the number 11 and the symmetry of 8 is the reason why they're displayed in these 2 different configurations. This is one of the tallest sculptures that Terry Adkins ever created, and it pays homage to the Silent Protest Parade, a demonstration that marked the beginning of organized protests for equal rights and justice for Black people in the United States. This image is taken from the New York Times. On Sunday, July 29th, 1917, W.E.B. Du Bois and the NAACP organized a silent protest to march down Fifth Avenue in New York. The idea for this event, which constituted a collective response to a series of lynchings around the country and the particularly violent East St. Louis riot, was first suggested by a Black woman and member of the NAACP at a meeting in 1916. New York Times coverage of the parade referred to the 8,000 protesters as, quote, marching to the beat of muffled drums. For me, the choice to include Terry's work here was the opportunity to have the sense of scale, monumental scale, not only horizontally, as you see in the protest photographs, and we'll see soon in Sam Gilliam's work, but also vertically. Just beyond the sculpture of Adkins is the protest photographs, hung in a very tight linear fashion that also is a chronology of events. For me, this was an opportunity to look at a century of protests in America for Black lives, and also again to connect the Louisville story to a national story. This is where it starts to get fun, at least for me. So again, I looked at the Speed Museum collection, and they have this incredible work by Sam Gilliam called Carousel Form 2 in their collection. In the September-October issue of Art in America, September-October 1917, Sam Gilliam was on the cover. In the September 2020 issue of Vanity Fair, as we all know, this is the first place most of us saw the portrait of Breonna Taylor by Amy Sherald that graced the cover. So we're looking at 50 years in between 2 artists who have their paintings on the cover of a magazine. There's also a very different kind of sense of representation. Gilliam's refusal of what could be called the expectations of representation, or perhaps the expectations that a Black male artist should be making work that is representational in nature. And then 50 years later, Amy Sherald leaning into, relying on, making her whole practice a project of representation. Within both magazines, important scholars of the time grapple with the ideas of the moment. And inside the magazine that Gilliam was on the cover of was Carousel Form 2, the same painting that I was able to show in the galleries back here. So in this way, the exhibition points to historical representations, especially in periodicals and print media, and arguably, mass media, material culture, the ways that Black painters have been, and Black painting practices have been elevated and contextualized. And then the fourth gallery is Remembrance. And in this section, very few works that paid homage to victims of gun violence and or police brutality and their legacies. So the work to the left here, the triptych, is by Maria Magdalena Campos Pons, and it was called Butterfly Eyes for Breonna. It came directly from the artist's studio and was created for the exhibition. The work on the left is by John Cesare Goff. This work was made after the shooting at the Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, which was and is John's community. Another view of the Remembrance section with works by Carrie James Marshall and Nick Cave. Again, Nick Cave is an artist that has been making work about gun violence and police brutality for a very long time. And then finally, the portrait. So one of the things I realized I could never resolve was making sure that I could meet the intention and ambition of every person that was a collaborator on the project. So what I did is I created an exhibition essentially within the exhibition. So this fifth gallery that has the portrait on your sightline, it's the only work in the galleries. And then I invited Ms. Palmer to write a timeline about Breonna Taylor's life. And the way that we got to this was quite interesting and is very important to note, because I think it's really a pathway for museums to allow for other voices in the space of the galleries. When I was first presenting my idea to Ms. Palmer, I said to her that I definitely knew I wanted a timeline. I didn't know if it was going to be a timeline of the incident. I didn't know if it was going to be a timeline of the protests or Breonna's life, but I also knew that I was not the person to write it. And she offered, I offered a few suggestions of writers in Louisville that had been given to me, and she offered right away that she would write it. And I thought, what more perfect way to contextualize the story of Breonna Taylor than through her mother's voice. And so when we were deciding on how to best frame her voice within the galleries, some of the people at the museum asked me to think about writing a label to explain what we were doing. And I pushed back on that really hard and just felt that by being the authorial and authoritative voice in that space, Tamika Palmer and the story of Breonna Taylor was centered, and it did not need contextualization from a curator, from the museum, from a scholar or the education department, that this was enough. And then of course, because there was also an intention and a desire to close out with a bit of a moment of refrain, a pause. The exhibition continued with Khalil Joseph's Black News and Hank Willis Thomas's Remember Me neon on the sightline. This is also where we had interpretives and asked people to give feedback about what they witnessed, what they're promising, what they'll remember. It was a place that had tables and chairs for people to congregate, because we knew that the exhibition itself was very heavy, and we just wanted to felt a responsibility to visitors to give them a space for care. And so that is everything.
That is everything. That's a that's amazing. Thank you, Allison.
Of course.
We have Eddie and Eddie and Amy. And I would just like to remind everyone that all participants are muted, but there is a questions module. Should say questions, and you can tap in if you have something that you wanted to talk about, and we will try and get to them.
Can I start us off with a question that's about curating art that is so socially engaged? You know, one of the things that I wonder, in working on projects like this, especially where there's so many relationships formed with, community and people, is what happens afterwards? How do you as a curator deal with that? How does the practice continue? Is it something, as a curator, who also has a job, how do you deal with, and how can artists and communities deal with the idea of not moving on from these big important work that that's being done, for example, through the show that you did? How is the speed continuing some of this work, and in Louisville, how are they continuing it? So I realize that's a lot of questions in one, but it's sort of about the aftermath, the life of social practice.
Thank you, Amy. That's the question, I think. I can speak to a few of those points. The Speed Museum continues to work with Toya Northington and the community committees, that model that she developed. As I understand it, she's also doing site visits with the curatorial team for touring exhibitions, so that she can understand what the context of the exhibition is in the organizing institution, and then how to translate it through the eyes of her role in the committee in the galleries. So it's that partnership between curatorial and community is continued. For me personally, doing talks like this is a wonderful opportunity to continue to talk about the project and continue to share the lessons and the ideas and the proposition itself. I also made a decision while working on this exhibition that I needed to be fully aware of where I was most impactful as a curator. I'm not a protester. I'm not going to be on the lines protesting. I'm not a policymaker, but I do have space and power in my field, in our field, and so I decided that I was most impactful close to the ground and with diverse communities. And so that was really what prompted my move to Houston, because I wanted to be in a diverse city that was thinking about foregrounding these connections. And so that's how I'm able to continue it. And then also there'll be a catalog. So I just found out that the catalog is happening, which means it's an opportunity to return. Luckily, I was able to give some context to Namak, and they currently have the portrait on view. And as I understand it, they also decided to install Tamika Palmer's timeline. So that's a way to kind of continue it. I really encouraged the team there to think about having her voice in the space. They're of course looking at Black community in the United States broadly, and communities. They have a very different purview, and this particular issue of gun violence and police brutality had a very different purview than Louisville. But to be able to encourage them to articulate, to allow Tamika Palmer to have a voice in that space is also how it continues. It's really only been, it's September. The exhibition closed on what would have been Breonna Taylor's birthday. I believe what would have been her 26th birthday. And I went out for the event that her mother hosted and that the Speed hosted, but it's really only been a few months since the exhibition closed. So for me, it's still so present, and it's still so relevant. And I hope to stay engaged.
We do have a question about the catalog. So there's a catalog being made, and I thought it was very interesting, your talk about making some sort of writing for the timeline, that you wanted it to be experiential. So will the catalog, speak to that? Because it's really interesting in museums, you come in and most audiences come in fresh. So how do you balance that idea of the experience versus giving them an entry point?
Yeah, I think I think I'll speak first to the point of the catalog, which is we don't know yet. I just found out that the funding was approved, and so we haven't even started working on it yet. And I'm actually scheduled this week to talk to the team about some ideas, which is really exciting to me, because I think it does provide a different kind of opportunity to have another kind of entry point, right? I often think of exhibitions as a book, right? And the images tell the story, the images in the text contextualize a kind of a thesis, an idea, and how can the book become not only a document for the archive, but also perhaps a different kind of experience. And so I think it's an interesting balance that I don't know if anyone ever strikes perfectly, but I think that's the work, is getting as close as possible to the entry point and the experiential moment, really kind of coming together in an accessible way.
Definitely. Also, one other thing from your talk that really struck me was your idea of not showing images of trauma. Can you talk a little bit more? I mean, I can definitely understand why, but what was your thought process?
Well, I think this is very personal. It was a choice that I made as a curator. I'm not interested in re-traumatizing people. I'm not interested in, and don't watch the videos that are aired over and over and over again in the news. I feel like it desensitizes us to what is happening and the fact that these things can continue to happen. Not only police brutality, whether gun violence or in the case of Derek Chauvin, blatantly deciding to murder a man, deciding to murder George Floyd, but that, like anything that's extremely violent, I think that the more that we watch it, the more we're desensitized. And I really felt a responsibility in that space to not be traumatizing someone or re-traumatizing someone is such a delicate subject matter. And I don't always think that affect equals impact in a way that's positive. And so this, for me, it's a very political position. There are artists that I chose to not ask to engage because their work did that. I don't necessarily think that I'm right and they're wrong, or vice versa. It's just, for me, it serves a larger purpose of understanding and realizing that we're already so desensitized that I don't want to do that and or traumatize people.
And Allison, can you, for people who don't know about it, can you also talk about some of wasn't there a meditation offered in the exhibition? I mean, some of the tools that you provided, because even if you didn't have traumatic images, there's, trauma is a part of this, the knowing about Breonna Taylor. So can you talk a little bit about how those things you decided to incorporate them and what they were for our audience?
Absolutely. So Alicia Wormsley is an artist who's had this text-based work, and the text basically says there are Black people in the future. And whenever she allows a curator or institution to realize the text either on the walls, inside the galleries, or on the facade of a building, she has a few requests, and she also has suggestions of contextualizing it. And in the past, she's worked with the Nat Ministry. And the Nat Ministry has this kind of brilliant platform of rest as a form of resistance, and meditation and self-care, not performative, but actually as a way to care for oneself, and to really pause on the idea of hustling and grind culture being the only way forward. And so Alicia encouraged me to talk to the Nat Ministry, which I did, and I worked with Trisha, who's brilliant, and she created a meditation for Breonna. I just wanted to make sure that as people were walking through the space, they could pause. And there's also moments of joy. Sam Gilliam's monumental draped paintings, he only created 8 of them, and many of them were homages to civil rights leaders created during the height of the civil rights movement, but they're also joyous. They're these gorgeous, brightly colored draped canvases, and we displayed it in a way that the Speed had not before displayed it, which was in a way that you could walk around it like a sculpture. So I imagined that I actually sat on the ground when talking to Holland Cotter about this, and like crouched around it with other people, because I imagined a 4-year-old walking up to the draped painting and kind of being overwhelmed by the shape and scale and the brilliance of the parabolic kind of drape, and seeing the world in a different way. And I also imagined a 40-year-old or a 20-year-old or a 60-year-old sitting on the ground and meditating underneath Sam's painting, imagining a kind of different future that affords joy and pleasure and calm and rest. And so those were these kinds of moments that were not only curatorial gestures to encourage a bit of play and exploration, but also moments to acknowledge that maybe you just needed a meditation, just needed to pause and like catch your breath. So that is one of the gestures. And Amy, thank you for asking that, because those decisions were really intentional, and they were the parts of care that I felt like I could give back to the space.
I think that's I appreciate that. I think it demonstrates a real respect for the work, for the art, for the art's power. I like that at the end of the exhibition is it accounted for that people just saw some really heavy stuff and experienced some really heavy feelings, and so that you account for that at the end really, to me, just demonstrates a real respect for the power of the art. And furthermore, to that point, Tamika Palmer's words, just her words, use on the wall, make them art now, you know, as far as I'm concerned. And I love your decision to just let them be words. And I think the way you put it was you didn't think that a curator could properly, you know, showcase them or display them. They just had to be. And so you started off saying, you know, what role the curator can have in this work in the community, beyond the museum. But it's also very important when you know something you can't do, and you step back and let that take over. I just think it demonstrates a real respect for the power of the art, and I really appreciate that. And I'm glad you expanded on the there are Black people in the future piece, because I had questions about that. Can you tell me when that started? I missed the year when that movement started. I feel like I can refer to it as a movement.
Yeah, I think I would too. And first off, thank you for that kind acknowledgement. This process was really about stepping in and then falling back, and like stepping aside and really just trying to be nimble and intuitive and sensitive to who I was in that space. And, I didn't always get it right, but I definitely always tried to listen. And then when people offered that, that might not be the right decision, I had to approach it with the same kind of humbleness and care as, I was the topic. So Alicia Wormsley first put that text on a billboard, I believe in 2016, in Pittsburgh, because there was a development that was, as they do, displacing communities of color, specifically a Black community. And the developers asked her to take down the billboard when she put it up, because they felt that, ironically, that it would dissuade people from moving into the community. And so it started to really take off. I first saw the billboard in Detroit in 2018. And it again, Detroit is a site of, really shifting and gentrification and knowing the city of my birth and seeing it change so much. And I no longer live there, but when I returned and I saw the billboard, I understood it. And the impact that it has within the galleries, especially in the space that holds the Dutch and Flemish collection typically, that it does this thing, right? It disrupts and interrupts a dominant narrative by articulating a future that perhaps the present can't really account for, right? And in those galleries, we're dealing with the tumults of the moment, the intersecting pandemics of police brutality, gun violence, and coronavirus, right? This moment where we're just dealing with the 24-hour news cycle. How is it possible that killings and gun violence increased in the year that we're supposed to be shut down? And so all of these questions were, I think, addressed with Alicia's text. And really, it's also the language of protest. And to your point of respecting the work, it's another way that the text and language could speak that in a way that I didn't need to. Because the fact that it ran like a Jenny Holzer or like a Felix Gonzalez Torres around the entirety of the second gallery, and you looked up and saw it, And artworks kind of framed it, and other interior architecture framed the way. Sometimes it became a question, sometimes it became, a sentence fragment. But it always allowed for a kind of futurity that perhaps the present moment wasn't affording.
That's amazing that that movement came out of a reaction to gentrification. It's a big, unpretty word, and I wish it was discussed more in the media. It affects so many societies. It hasn't really slowed down, I don't think, that I can tell. It might take on different forms, but at the end of the day, it's still gentrification. And you talk a lot about the role of an artist in society. I think everyone involved with Parge is just fascinated by that concept, what the artists can do for and in when it comes to these topics. And I think gentrification may not get discussed that much because it's to be addressed, it has to include a municipality, and that's a little trickier. But with something like raising awareness to gentrification, an artist can handle that, and they can do such a good job at it that they start a movement. And while that happens, we still are waiting on the municipality, so the gentrification still happens. And so I just, when you talk about the role of an artist, I think that anybody can really underestimate how significant that role can be.
I agree.
Yeah. I had another question as well about you were mentioning these spaces, these meditation spaces, and last week we had Asma Walton, who did the Black Art Library, and it got us thinking about the idea of a library. And a library is more, or at least a public library is more than just a place to house books. Just like a museum can be more than just a place to house artworks. And being the senior curator in Houston now, like, how do you see the museum's role as, a place to nurture the audiences?
Wow. Well, we don't have a collection, so that's another thing. I went from a collecting institution to non-collecting. And so we're really able to connect more directly artists and audiences and ideas. And so I think, I would say that I don't know about the role of the museum, but I can speak about my role as a curator, and especially in this place that I'm in as both senior curator and director of public art. Art doesn't always have to live in the space of the galleries to be impactful, and so it's really understanding that the site of the museum is not the most privileged site, and really breaking down the hierarchies between other sites of cultural production and the museum itself, and thinking critically with the teams about how an artist idea can be most impactful in Houston. Maybe that's not always behind.
I think there's a question that's been posed by Jenny Parsons, who's also a curator here, that I think might connect a little bit what you're saying. And she says, she thanks you for your talk, and she says, I'm interested in drawing out your comments about connecting the local to the national. What advice can you offer to other towns, cities, museums who want to offer support, even if they haven't had a similar local trauma, but want to show support for this national issue in a meaningful way? And that makes me think of your point about art not necessarily being in the gallery.
What a great question.
Yeah, that is a great question. Thank you. I connected the local to the national because of the way that the painting was going to be both in Louisville and at the Smithsonian, and also because the incident that happened with Breonna Taylor is not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pandemic in the United States. So everything that I did really operated within this framework of local and national. So I think if you can, in this particular instance, it was hinging on a painting, right? And hinging on a story. And it really was driven by the family and the communities that were on the ground. And so I think that for me, the way that I was successful was in centering those voices in the galleries and centering artist voices. And so this show in Louisville had the impact that it had, I think, because there were so many stakeholders at the table, and because there were so many stakeholders at the table with so many different perspectives and ideas. But I didn't center myself. You know, I didn't say that this is what it is. I tried to really steer clear of me as the sole author. When I talk about the exhibition, I talk about we, you know, I try to highlight and name the people that were a part of it. And I think that also speaks to its success. And so I think those points are really tools for how to work locally but have a national impact.
Definitely. We have another question asking you from Panina Lahav, who's my mother, asking if you could point us to some of the redemptive aspects of the exhibit.
That's a great question. It's a really great question. I would say that John Cesare Goff's film is probably one of the most redemptive in a sense, because Sonia Sanchez, it's like a spell in the space. And remember, the audio was really loud. And if you had the opportunity to visit the exhibition in the galleries, you would hear it. So the audio was, you'd hear it as soon as you walked into the galleries that had Theaster Gates on one side and Sam Gilliam on the other. So you're hearing this kind of like low sound that is, you know, it's Sweet Honey and the Rock in their gospel. So it sounds like it's a familiar kind of sound in space. And Sonia is saying, come, come, come to the battlefield. And she's calling everyone into the space. So it's bringing you into this moment and saying, you know, come into this battlefield called life. Bring your, she names different colors, sexual orientations, genders. And she basically calls upon all of us to stand together in solidarity in this space. And I mean, I get chills just talking about it. So I feel that if that's not redemptive in the sense of asking for us to come together and providing a platform for what that looks like, I don't know what is. It's also important to note, which was really difficult for me to understand. I don't know if everyone remembers early on the Mother Emanuel, the congregation immediately forgave the white supremacist who murdered the parishioners and Reverend Pickney immediately. And I think that sense of, and that message of healing is one that can be interpreted in many forms, no matter what your beliefs are, even if you don't believe in anything, you know? So that's where I think the most, for me, the redemptive moments are.
Only love can drive out hate. That's what it is.
I agree.
You know, seeing just wanted to say, I forget the artist's name, but the Madonna in a cage.
Theaster Gates.
Yes. You had mentioned it's sometimes hard to tell if the cage is prohibiting her from getting out or from, you know, protecting, you know, her and prohibiting us from getting in. And I think it might be because that figure screams authority and, you know, like it's a holy figure, and you just can't wrap your mind around it being in a cage. Like if you walk in and you see that there's a cage and something's in it, your brain tells you something first, and then you see the figure in the cage and you just immediately start trying to figure out a way to make it make sense. There's no way she could be being, you know, prisoned in this cage. And so I think that's why your brain just kind of makes you question it, because it doesn't make sense and it's such a jarring image. You brought up the perspective of a 4-year-old before, and I almost was thinking that, but with this piece, that, you know, what you have to look through the cage to appreciate the figure, but what does it do mentally to forget about the cage? We had a lecture with Cadix Herrera, and he had a piece about children in cages, and the most poignant part about that series is that the figures of the children are in celebratory poses. So you have kids like, you know, like celebrating, but they're in this cage. And I think when you talked about not traumatizing people if you didn't have to, it goes back again to appreciating the power of the art. People are here because they understand the trauma that was, you know, that is the catalyst for this exhibition. So they come here to try to understand the trauma. If that's the case, then they already know it exists. You don't have to present it to them again. So I appreciated that part. But I also really appreciate, because we're desensitized to it. So it isn't actually that effective sometimes. And I think with Cadix's piece, with the children in cages, I really appreciated that he had them in those victorious poses, because it's an easy point to make, to show them sad in the cages, but that might be the desensitized thing. You stop and look at a kid that's celebrating inside of a cage. It really makes you stop and figure it out a little more and think about it a little harder.
Allison, for that piece with Theaster was with the cage, I noticed there was a stark shadow behind it. Is the shadow is that just part of the image, or is that an interesting part of the work?
Must be a part of the image.
Okay.
There's not a shadow. It's the entire work is contained within the cage. It's interesting because Eddie, you said something about the cage early on that felt like a metaphor for the entire exhibition, and it made me want to point out the impact of Breonna Taylor's mother's timeline. There were many people that, as I understand it, who believed that Breonna Taylor was a drug dealer, and who believed all of the media sensationalization around her, and allowed those sound bites to drive who they understood her to be, which was so far from the truth. And so in having that timeline there, it also made Breonna Taylor your sister, your daughter, your niece, your cousin, your mother, your best friend, your neighbor. She could be anybody.
Your neighbor.
And therefore, she could be everybody. And in that way, that's where the empathy allowed her to be a human. And sometimes in these spaces, a little empathy can go a long way. And that's really what I think the timeline did. And also the cage, in a sense, because your question, like, why is she in a cage? And it's a beautiful kind of metaphor to move through, like trying to understand how this could happen, why the story of Breonna Taylor and her image posthumously is so contested. And so thank you.
Were there any anecdotes? I mean, it made me think of you saying that there were people coming that thought, had one set of beliefs about Breonna Taylor and then were changed. I don't know. Can you think of any other anecdotes of what, some interesting things that happened during the show running that we wouldn't have heard about?
Yeah, and they're all anecdotes that are told to me. I had some community advisory committees tell me that the story of that making Breonna Taylor a person, the timeline making her a human. And then I have one thing I loved, which I actually saw, was we didn't do a public opening in a way that we had a party, first for donors and then for public, because it was first off fully funded primarily by the Ford Foundation, and also because it wasn't about that. It was about being accessible. We did have a preview day for the families because we wanted to make sure that we provided that kind of care for the first time most family members would see the portrait, and also for the families of Travis Najdi and Tyler Girth, who were either represented in portrait form or within their own work. But on the first public open day, a bunch of people, the two photographers who I talked about, Xavier Burrell and John Cherry, were in the galleries for the public day documenting, and we were able to hire them for a lot of things. And John pointed out a group of well-dressed people, like just, like looking good on a Tuesday or a Wednesday, and he said, those are so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so from the protest movement. And I was like, oh my God, like excited and nervous. And he's like, yeah, I've never seen them dressed this way because I see them in such different settings. So they walked through and then saw the photographs and started to identify people in the photographs. And, then I introduced myself to them and asked if I could take a photograph of them in front of the portrait of Travis. And that was probably one of the most exciting anecdotes, similar to so many of the other exciting moments, but to have them come first day, 10 a.m., right when we're open, dressed to the nines, really was a great experience for me to be able to greet them and meet them and know that they were interested in this exhibition.
Yeah, talk about like the ideas of community. I know Parge is all about creating community through art, and this idea of you know, having the living history and the, you know, the contemporary history coming straight into the gallery space is amazing.
That was really a treat.
Well, I think we're running up on 4:20, so unless there were any last minute questions, I would really love to thank you, Allison. This has been great. Learned so
And
much.
there's other comments that from our audience too about how wonderful and powerful this talk has been too. So I want you to know that those are in our question module as well. Just praise for what you've shared with us.
Yes, thank you for a bit of vernacular that you kind of bestowed upon us, and I'm going to start using it more. You use the phrase "activate the painting,"
Mm-hmm.
and I thought, yeah, we kind of do that, don't we? But to use those words, it's perfect. Activate the painting. I love that. So thank you for that. And your time.
Thank you. Thank you all so much.